as we've mentioned on a previous list, the success of a video game is destined to spawn a slew of imitators. Doom gave birth to an avalanche of first-person shooters. Every fighter in some part owes their existence to Street Fighter, and Dark Souls, well, that's responsible for a new genre of gaming, which is just crying and rage quitting. And that's what we're here to talk about today. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 more shameless video game rip-offs that were actually great. Number 10, Simpsons Hit and Run, Grand Theft Auto 3. Since The Simpsons is a Titan IP, it's no surprise that Matt Groening's cartoon has birthed a myriad of video games. But even when The Simpsons was in its prime, most of the games ranged from, well, okay to utterly terrible. I mean, Simpsons Wrestling, ooh! Now, although it sounded odd to create a Simpsons title inspired by the hyper-violent Grand Theft Auto franchise, The Simpsons Hit and Run, well, it turned out bloody great. Like Ubisoft's South Park games, the creators worked directly with The Simpsons' writers to ensure that Hit and Run invoke the spirit of the show. The town of Springfield is so vast and detailed that players feel like they're in a Simpsons episode. Of course, none of this would matter if the gameplay wasn't up to scratch. Though Radical Entertainment bungled the driving mechanics in the Simpsons Road Rage game, they worked out most of the bugs this time around. Although you still get odd glitching here and there, it's not enough to ruin the gaming experience. And if it does, we can always blame bloody Flanders. It may not give GTA a full run for its money, but Simpsons lovers were more than satisfied by what they got. Thanks to Hit and Run, fans of the iconic TV series can finally say that they have a Simpsons game that they truly, truly love. Number 9, Guitar Hero Guitar Freaks. Now, Rock Band got a bit of stick upon releasing for copying Guitar Hero, despite the fact that both series were actually made by the same company. Also, it's Guitar Hero that really should be labelled a riff-off, since it plagiarised Konami's Guitar Freaks, which was released 6 years earlier. Red Octane and Harmonix didn't just steal the concept, but actually specific aspects of the game, including the guitar-shaped controller, the coloured plastic buttons, the style point system, and the scrolling fretboard. However, it's understandable how Guitar Hero blew its predecessor out of the water. Harmonix's rhythm game put more focus on visuals, fine-tuned the mechanics to perfection, and made the core gameplay accessible to even the most tone-deaf of gamers. Most importantly, Guitar Hero had songs from the biggest rock bands in the world, giving it a huge amount of brand recognition. With gamers being able to play music from Metallica, Nirvana, Queen, the Red Hot Chili Peppers, and many other rock legends in their own living room, it's easy to see why Guitar Hero went on to earn a monumental $2 billion. Props to Konami for coming up with the idea, but there's no question who did it better. Number 8, Diddy Kong Racing or Mario Kart. Now, Mario Kart's copycats started cropping up almost immediately after the Italian plumber took to the track. Over the years, companies have churned out their own imitators, including Crash Team Racing, Disney Speedstorm, and a gaggle of Sonic racing titles. However, one of the best Mario Kart clones also happens to be amongst the earliest, Diddy Kong Racing. As can be expected from a rare title, this cutesy racer has creative levels, sharp controls, accessible gameplay, and catchy tunes. But Diddy Kong Racing is more than just a reskin. Rather than just driving karts, Diddy and his friends can take to the skies in planes or zoom through the ocean in hovercrafts. Each vehicle works very differently and gives the gameplay a great sense of diversity. Rather than collecting randomized items on each race, the power-ups are color-coded, each offering a specific item, and repeatedly picking up the same power-up upgrades the item, forcing drivers to heavily rely on strategy in each race. Also, don't let the adorable aesthetic fool you, Diddy Kong Racing is tough as nails, offering a real challenge to anyone. Although the multiplayer pales in comparison to Mario Kart, the single player, well, that is phenomenal. Due to the elaborate hub world, dozens of races, rock-hard boss battles, imaginative challenges, secret levels, and the Grand Prix mode, it's hard to think of many racing titles that put this much effort into their main campaign as this gem did. Number 7, Streets of Rage Final Fight. Now, at a glance, it's obvious that Sega used Capcom's Final Fight as a canvas for their own beat-em-up Streets of Rage. Not only does SOR have the same look, structure, and enemies, the protagonist's wardrobe is pretty much identical to Final Fight's Cody, down to the same bloody blue wristbands. But since Streets of Rage had more varied attacks, a balanced combat system, and Yuzo Koshiro's head-bopping soundtrack, Sega's brawler was clearly the superior of the two. Also, Streets of Rage's heroes can summon a rocket-launching cop to kill all enemies on screen. I mean, how is Final Fight meant to compete with that? And when Streets of Rage 2 was hailed as one of the best games on the Mega Drive, it wasn't long before Final Fight was perceived as the poor imitation. And Capcom kept pushing, churning out multiple sequels, but sadly, none of these follow-ups made much of an impact. And I mean, let's be honest, did you even know that Final Fight had sequels until now? And with the success of 2020's Streets of Rage 4, the series has continued to maintain relevancy even after 4 decades. Final Fight, on the other hand, has become kind of a forgotten relic of the past. Number 6. Dino Crisis Resident Evil. I mean, can Dino Crisis be classified as a clone of Resident Evil considering both properties were made by the same company and director? Well, since the Jurassic title is often dubbed Resident Evil with dinosaurs, calling it a ripoff is kind of understandable. Be that as it may, Dino Crisis is anything but a cheap doppelganger. Rather than dealing with plodding zombies, our red-headed heroine is up against lightning-fast velociraptors and screen-filling T-Rexes, forcing players to constantly think on their feet. And since ammo is incredibly limited, strategy is critical, forcing our heroine to stun or trap the primeval creatures rather than blasting everything in sight. And rather than churning out more of the same, Dino Crisis 2 is far more action-oriented and offers more diverse gameplay, including first-person boss battles and an elaborate underwater section. The gameplay of the sequel is more dynamic, since points are rewarded for killing enemies in rapid succession, and these points can then be used to buy and upgrade gear, and this concept was actually later implemented into Resident Evil itself. Dino Crisis 3, on the other hand, may be utter trash, but the first two installments deserve far more credit than they've ever received. Number 5. Proteus Doom. After Doom redefined first-person shooters during the 1990s, many games in the genre were referred to as Doom clones. This is kind of unfair, since plenty of FPSs of that era stood on their own merits, including Quake and Duke Nukem. With that said, Proteus is totally a Doom clone. Bouncing Boxes shooter boasts the same structure, style, pixelated art, enemies, and weapons as Doom, to the point where this crowd-funded title feels kinda like a spin-off. Rather than trying to dress itself up as something different, Proteus never shies away from where it drew its inspiration. However, Proteus is an absolute triumph, boasting well-designed levels, addictive gameplay, challenging enemies, and creative trial modes. It also offers an easy-to-use level editor, allowing players to devise their own hellish landscapes from scratch. And as hard as it is to believe, Proteus is actually superior to the original Doom in some ways. While getting lost is a regular problem in id Software's iconic IP, Proteus solves that issue by programming demons to spawn near the next destination. If the player doesn't know where to go, they can follow the enemies like breadcrumbs in order to reach their goal. I mean, how come Doom has never thought of that? Also, the creators can be commended for making the 3D characters resemble 2D to maintain the feel of a retro shooter. Even though it would have been just dramatically easier to make 3D enemies look, well, 3D, the developers stuck to their guns, and that is proof that Proteus isn't just an imitation, but a pure passion project. Number 4. Metal Slug Contra. So Metal Slug is a run-and-gun side-scroller where players must blast through a wave of enemies and colossal bosses, using myriad creative weapons, explosives, and tank-like vehicles. Although the developers incorporated elements from their previous work Gun Force and In the Hunt, it's clear Metal Slug stole most of its ideas from Contra, and the sequels actually threw in aliens just to make that comparison more apparent. However, there are enough differences in this bullet hell shooter to justify its existence. The beautiful hand-drawn animations are stellar, especially the creative death sequences. The 3-button control system makes the gameplay accessible to anyone, and although Contra has baddies coming from all angles, it kind of feels tame compared to Metal Slug, with enemies pouring onto the screen every second. Rather than receiving heavy weapons at random intervals, the heroes are rewarded for rescuing prisoners, putting more focus on strategy. Since powerhouse weapons have limited ammo, this further incentivizes players to rescue prisoners so they can maximize their arsenal. On top of that, Metal Slug is just downright hilarious. While shooting at mummies, robots, and giant enemy crabs, players are sure to be giggling to themselves due to the tongue-in-cheek humor. Number 3. Minecraft Infiniminer. So Minecraft has sold over 300 million copies, making it the most successful video game by a pretty significant margin. So it's safe to say that Mojang's blocky title has done pretty well for itself. And this is all the more impressive considering that Minecraft's premise was mined from another source. In Zach Barth's Infiniminer, players had to travel around a procedurally generated map to mine for materials. Despite coming up with the concept, Barth didn't see the project's potential. Though Infiniminer focuses on teams racing against each other to find precious material, players were far more interested in building elaborate structures with their findings. After Swedish programmer Marcus Persson played Infiniminer, he believed that the game would benefit if the building mechanics had more variation. 2 years later, he created his own version of Infiniminer, which became Minecraft. Now, there's no question the pixelated sandbox game is derivative. I mean, it was literally built from the same art and code as Barth's work. However, this cube-oriented title was leagues ahead of the game that it actually spawned from, even in its original state. With Minecraft boasting more features than ever nowadays, it's clear why this is still going strong after a decade. Number 2. Saints Row Grand Theft Auto 3. Now don't worry, Saints Row made it onto the list this time. Comparisons between Grand Theft Auto 3 and Volition's sandbox title were guaranteed, since Saints Row copied, well, pretty much everything from Rockstar's biggest IP. Even though the first two installments received decent reviews, it looked like Saints Row might struggle as a franchise, since it didn't do much to distinguish itself from GTA. Thankfully, that all changed with Saints Row 3. Hoping to carve out a distinctive identity for itself, the sequel's developers threw in over-the-top violence, cartoonish gameplay, slapstick humor, and wink-to-the-camera gags. Rather than taking place in a realistic setting, the later installments had the protagonist becoming president of the United States, journeying to hell, and fighting off an alien empire. It may have started as a shameless rip-off, but Saints Row truly began to thrive when it moved out of GTA's shadow. Sure, Grand Theft Auto is still the top dog in the sandbox genre, but does it have a demonic dance number, shark guns, or wrestling legend Rowdy Roddy Piper reenacting his iconic fight scene from They Live? No, and therefore I rest my case. And number 1, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, Metroid. Now, Metroidvania is a subgenre of platforming games that center around non-linear exploration in an interconnected world. Although certain sections are initially inaccessible, they can be unlocked when key items are obtained. Now, the term Metroidvania is an obvious portmanteau of Metroid and Castlevania, despite the fact these two franchises started off drastically different. Save for Castlevania 2, the vampire hunting saga was a pretty formulaic platformer for the first decade. For Castlevania Symphony of the Night, though, Konami decided to focus more on exploration, inspiring them to utilize the same non-linear structure that Metroid was renowned for. However, the developers went above and beyond to ensure that this PS1 title didn't come across as a mere imitation. Symphony implemented role-playing elements, including experience points, upgradable weapons, and stat boosting. It also put a huge emphasis on elaborate secrets, with the second half of the game sealed away until players actually figured out how to get to it. Although Symphony was well received, nobody could grasp how significant this genre shift would be. Not only did future Castlevania installments continue with this new style, it unintentionally popularized the Metroidvania genre. With the benefit of hindsight, Symphony has been lavished with further praise, since it indirectly led to the creation of many great Metroidvanias, including Ori, Bloodstained, Dead Cells, and Hollow Knight. Even though rip-offs are considered lazy, it's apparent that Symphony of the Night did something right, since it fittingly spawned its own legion of rip-offs.